Hello and welcome back. In this particular video, I'm going to start talking about, or I'm going to do the demonstration of how to write effective class diagrams and sequence diagrams in parallel. Just in the interest of time, I've done a little bit of ground-up work, and if you notice, I have started a new class diagram. I've identified about 5 classes, and I've also started a sequence diagram, which I'm going to show you in a minute, but I've not drawn too much of details. I just did the groundwork in the interest of time, as I mentioned earlier. Now, I've also mentioned the technology stack so that we know for which technology we are trying to develop this. And I hope you all remember the scenario. The scenario is a garage rep goes to the index.jsp page, provides login information, and will be able to successfully log into the system, in which case he's going to be taken to the home page where we need to show a bunch of bookings, right? So that's the scenario which we're trying to model. Now, a couple of things to note about this. First question might be, why is that we did not add the username and password as member variables of user VO itself? And the primary reason for that being, you got to look at the life cycle of objects for you to decide how to model the various attributes. Login VO, the information, that's the username and password, is actually required for only one request response cycle, whereas we typically use something like a user VO object and put that into the session for us to really know whether a given user has logged in or not. So hence the life cycle of this user VO is going to span across multiple request responses, whereas login VO doesn't. So that's the main reason that I've not done that. I've kept them actually as 2 separate VO objects. Yes, I've not yet modeled any of the methods. You should also note that I've actually not modeled any of the relationships, and I'll tell you why in a little bit. So this is the setup or the groundwork that I've actually done for the class diagram. Now, I would actually do it at this level, and then I would actually switch over to the sequence diagram. So this is basically what I mean by doing these things in parallel. Do some of the work as part of the class diagram and move to the sequence diagram. So I'm going to go to the sequence diagram. And if you notice, one of the most important things that you should do when you write a sequence diagram is to first write down the scenario for which you're trying to model it. So the scenario is, as we note, it's the garage rep who's going to successfully log into the system and will be taken to the home page where today's bookings are going to be displayed. And also note that garage rep is already on the index page. So this is very, very good information to have, and we'll see why and how this information not only helps us as modelers while we are doing the model itself, and the other very important reason is whoever is your target audience, you're actually telling that particular person as to what is the purpose or for what scenario have you solved this particular sequence diagram for. You don't want your end audience or the recipient of this particular design to think about that. That information should be given to them, nor should they make any assumptions about it. So hence it's a very good idea to write the scenario down. Okay, now with this particular groundwork, let's start adding the messages. So if you're the garage rep, if you're going to give the user ID and password, the message that's going to go back is going to be some kind of a do post method because it's a form submission. And given that we are actually using a Spring MVC based application, it's going to be the dispatch servlet, which is the servlet that's provided to you by the Spring framework itself, which handles the request. It is basically acting as a front controller design pattern. That's a topic for a different day, but it is a good idea to mention the dispatch servlet because that's the one that's going to help us transfer at the very end of the sequence diagram to a view. So we'll see that a little later. And yes, dispatch servlet is not a class that we are trying to write, but it's still a good idea to capture it here because it gives us a good starting point on the server side. So please note, end user or any action taken by the actor typically happens on the browser side. So when he submits that button, that's when the request response cycle really started off, and it started off by doing a form submission which ended up calling the do post method on the dispatch servlet. So once the dispatch servlet gets this particular request, the first thing it's going to do is going to create the login VO based on the request parameters that came in and depending on the command binding that you would have given on the JSP. And the next thing it's actually going to do, okay, so the dispatch servlet is going to it right. So I have to click message, and it starts from here to login controller. It's going to create it, and the next thing it's going to do, we need to define a method now. We need to define a method for us to handle this post message that actually has come back. So let's call that particular method, we'll call it as handle login, and it'll actually, we'll need two parameters that Spring is automatically going to dependency inject for us: login VO, and we'll also need a model for us to send some information to the target page. So we'll ask for that. And yes, if you know how Spring works, the return type actually can either be a model and a view object, or in this particular case we're just going to keep it as a string, because based on that string we'll be able to figure out where is the target we want to send the user to. So if you note, I've basically modeled my methods such that they actually have fully qualified signatures. So from now on, the moment login controller gets created, Spring will automatically dependency inject all the other dependencies that it actually has. So I'm actually not going to be saying new for user service. I'm simply going to say the message that it needs to call on the user service is going to be something like authenticate user, and we'll be passing the login VO object as an argument. So we have not yet figured out what the return type of this particular method is, because we still don't know. We're trying to design that, so we'll come back to that and figure that out later. But right now I'm just going to say the I just want to move this down a little bit, this method call, so that it's easy for us to read a little more. There you go, that's better. So we are inside the user service now. So similarly, user service will automatically have, because of dependency injection, have an instance of user DAO. So it should be able to make a method call called as let's say authenticate, and it will also pass login VO as an argument. Now that we are inside the user DAO, we are going to make, let's say, a simple JDBC call. Let's not worry about Spring JDBC templates and all of that. Let's assume that we are making a JDBC call as an assumption for this. Now, why did I show database here? Should we really show database even though it's actually not an object? Now, the way to answer that question is, this is not, you're not going to get an answer for this question if you look at from a UML standpoint of view. UML will just give us notations. But the way to answer this particular question would be to ask ourselves the question as to what is the purpose for which we are trying to write this diagram for, or who is the target audience for whom we are trying to write it. So for me, if the target audience is not always clear, I always assume it's going to be a fresher, a person who's going to be fresh out of college, who may or may not know these technologies and diagrams to the last level detail. And hence, any extra information that we give to that person will serve the purpose of helping that person in implementing the design that we actually have. But if I know I'm actually trying to write this diagram for myself, I might actually skip it. Or if I know I'm trying to write it for a technical lead or an architect and they basically will know how to handle database calls, I might skip it as well. But just to show you how we could do it, I'm just going to show it in this particular case. So from inside the DAO, we're going to make a call, and there I'll say something like select statement, and I probably will put a note somewhere either on top here or bottom here, telling the person what are the database, where do they need to go, what kind of select statements that they need to run, so on and so forth, so that it actually helps them do that. Now that we have gone to the database, I do not have to worry about the negative case, because look at the scenario. The scenario that we are considering is a successful one. So that means I don't have to, at this point, I don't have to worry about a negative scenario. If I really need to worry about that, I probably will write a separate sequence diagram altogether. So that's the purpose of writing a scenario down. It will actually help you focus on what you yourself are writing this particular diagram for. So hence, because of the scenario that I have noted here, I'm going to focus only on the positive flow. So given that database call worked, so I'm going to assume that the user exists. Now I actually have to figure out what is the return type of my authenticate method. Now there are a couple of different ways how we could have gone about doing it. One of the ways we could have said is authenticate method could actually return a boolean, correct? But if I were to go with the boolean approach, I then would actually have to, from a user service, I have to make another call to get all the information and get a user view object, because I really need to create this user object and put it into the session. So in order to solve all of that and not do another call, right here inside my DAO, I'm actually going to go create a new user view object. I'm simply going to say new, and based on the information that I already have based on my select statement, I'm going to populate this. I might have to go to the database to get the role information. Select role info, because they typically are modeled in a separate table. And once I get that role information, I'm going to say set role ID for now. And once I have this, now I know that the return type of my authenticate method is actually going to be the user view object. So I'm going to come back and add that, and that's going to be the same thing even for okay, just give me 1 second. That's going to be the same even for the authenticate user of our service method. So now we've successfully gone to the database, authenticated the user against the database, created a user view, and we are back at the login controller, correct? And before we go any step further, the next thing we ought to do is go put this user view object that we have into the session. This is typically done such that this is a way for us, given that HTTP is not stateful, this is the way we actually solve that particular problem by keeping some information about this particular user in the user session, so that we know that this particular user has authenticated already, and hence we know we can continue with the other operations. So I'm going to simply say set, and just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to say user view. Now that we have figured so many things out, if you notice, we have figured out methods, signatures of all those particular methods, return types of those particular methods across so many different objects. And that itself was such a useful information, which is actually going to help you if you're now, I'm just going to save the file, if you can actually come back to the class diagram, and now you can populate all this information back. So I'm going to take 1 minute to populate this back, but I will come back and show you how this information that you have now figured out as part of the sequence diagram will actually help you identify the relationships correctly. So just give me a second.